Sheriff Carter Lockley was the kind of man every town wished they had, fair, kind, and unwavering in his commitment to justice. For over a decade, he had served his community with integrity, making a name for himself as someone who always put others before himself. Whether it was breaking up disputes, mentoring troubled teens, or simply checking in on the elderly, Carter had built a reputation as a lawman who truly cared. His neighbors adored him. At every town gathering, he was greeted with warm handshakes, friendly waves, and even the occasional homemade pie from the elderly couple down the street. Carter never let his badge separate him from the people he served. He was one of them, just a man trying to do what was right. But not everyone saw him that way. Karen Whitmore, his next-door neighbor, had made it her personal mission to make his life miserable from the day he moved in. At first, Carter chalked it up to a simple case of a nosy neighbor with too much time on her hands. But it quickly became clear that Karen's hostility toward him was something far deeper than mere curiosity. She lodged complaints against him for the most ridiculous reasons: his grass was too green, his car was parked suspiciously, and even that he was disturbing the peace by saying hello to his own guests. When none of that worked, she resorted to glaring at him through her curtains, watching his every move like a hawk hunting its prey. Carter never engaged. He had dealt with difficult people before, and he wasn't about to let Karen's antics get under his skin. But ignoring her didn't stop the problem, it only made it worse. And soon, Karen's passive-aggressive behavior would take a dangerous turn. It had been a long day at work, the kind that made Carter's shoulders ache from exhaustion. His shift had been filled with paperwork, de-escalating arguments, and running from one call to another. By the time he pulled into his driveway, all he wanted was a hot shower and a few moments of peace. But peace was the last thing he was about to get. As he stepped out of his patrol car and walked toward his mailbox, the last voice he wanted to hear sliced through the quiet evening air. "What do you think you're doing?" Carter barely had time to sigh before Karen came storming out of her house, her face twisted in fury. "Just getting my mail, Karen." "Same as every day," he responded, keeping his voice even. Karen's eyes burned with accusation. "That's my mailbox. You're stealing my mail." Carter stopped, brow furrowing. "Karen, this is my house. That is my mailbox." He pointed to the numbers on the box, crystal clear against the fading sunlight. But Karen wasn't listening. "Liar. I've had enough of your harassment. I'm calling the police," she shrieked, whipping out her phone. Carter knew where this was going. He had seen people like her before, people who were so convinced of their own narratives that no amount of logic could reach them. Shaking his head, he turned away, deciding it was best to let her rant. But then, something in Karen snapped. Instead of backing off, she did the unthinkable. Before Carter could take another step, Karen lunged at him. It happened so fast that, for a split second, Carter almost didn't believe it. One moment, she was screaming at him, her face red with fury, and the next, her hands were clawing at his uniform. Her nails scraped against his forearm as she tried to yank the mail from his grip. "You think you can just do whatever you want? You don't belong here," she shrieked. Carter instinctively pulled back, his training kicking in. "Karen, step away," he said, his voice firm but controlled. But Karen wasn't listening. Her eyes were wild, filled with a rage that didn't match the situation. She swung again, this time slapping at his badge, her fingers dangerously close to his radio and service weapon. Carter had handled violent criminals, gang members, and unstable suspects before, but never had he expected to face an attack in his own front yard, from his neighbor, no less. "I said back off," he warned, stepping further away. Karen let out a guttural scream and lunged again. This time, she went for his belt. That was it. In one swift motion, Carter reached for his taser and fired. A loud crackle filled the air as the probes connected. Karen's body stiffened instantly, her mouth falling open in shock as the electrical current coursed through her. She collapsed onto the pavement, stunned but conscious. For a moment, silence filled the neighborhood, broken only by Karen's ragged breaths. Carter exhaled, his heart still pounding. Keeping his movements precise and controlled, he knelt beside her and secured her wrists in handcuffs. "Karen Whitmore, you're under arrest for assaulting an officer," he stated, his voice calm but unwavering. Karen's face twisted in disbelief. "You can't do this to me. I'm the victim." Carter ignored her protests as he reached for his radio. "This is Sheriff Lockley, requesting a unit at my residence. Suspect in custody." As he stood up, his neighbors had begun peeking out their windows, their expressions a mix of shock and curiosity. Carter knew this was going to be the talk of the town. But what no one realized yet was that this incident was only the tip of the iceberg. By the time backup arrived, Karen was still spewing accusations. "He attacked me. He's stealing from me. This is police brutality." The responding officers, Carter's own colleagues, exchanged knowing looks. They had heard about Karen's antics before, but none of them had expected her to take it this far. Officer Mitchell, one of Carter's closest friends on the force, knelt beside Karen and let out a sigh. "Ma'am, you're being arrested for assaulting an officer. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." "I didn't do anything," Karen shrieked. Carter shook his head and handed over his body cam footage. "It's all on tape," he said simply. Mitchell gave him a nod before helping Karen to her feet and guiding her toward the patrol car. "Let's go." As Karen was driven away, Carter exhaled, rubbing his temples. It should have ended there, a violent neighbor arrested for her actions. But later that night, when investigators combed through Karen's home for further evidence, they made a chilling discovery. Behind the perfectly manicured lawn and the flower beds filled with garden gnomes, Karen had been hiding a dark secret. Inside her home, police found a stash of white supremacist propaganda, pamphlets, flags, even membership records. Karen wasn't just an angry, nosy neighbor, she was an active member of a local extremist group. That's why she had targeted Carter. Not because he was her neighbor. Not because of some imagined slight. But because of the color of his skin. The news spread through town like wildfire. People who had once thought Karen was just a nuisance now realized she had been hiding a deep-rooted hatred all along. The very idea that someone like her had been living among them, secretly harboring such vile beliefs, sent shivers down everyone's spines. As Carter sat on his porch that night, staring at the flashing lights down the street, he felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief. Disgust. Even a bit of sorrow. He had dealt with racism before. He had faced bigots. But this had been right next door. And he never even saw it coming. Karen Whitmore's arrest sent shockwaves through the community. Many had thought of her as just an overbearing busybody, an annoying but harmless neighbor. But now, the truth was out, she wasn't just difficult, she was dangerous. The evidence against her was overwhelming. Her home was filled with hate-fueled propaganda, her social media accounts revealed years of racist rants, and neighbors started coming forward with their own stories. It turned out Carter wasn't the only one she had harassed, other minority families in the neighborhood had been on the receiving end of her intimidation tactics, though most had been too afraid to speak up. But not anymore. The town rallied around Carter, disgusted that someone like Karen had been among them for so long. Support poured in from all directions, neighbors dropped off food, local businesses offered free services, and people even wrote letters to the mayor demanding that hate crimes be taken more seriously. Karen, on the other hand, faced serious legal trouble. Assaulting a law enforcement officer was bad enough, but once her ties to a hate group were exposed, the prosecution pushed for additional charges. She was charged with assault, filing a false police report, harassment, and a hate crime enhancement. Her trial was swift and humiliating. The courtroom was packed, with reporters covering every detail. The prosecution played the body cam footage, showing Karen's attack in crystal clear detail. They displayed the hateful materials found in her home. Witness after witness testified about her long history of racial harassment. Karen's defense was weak at best. She tried to play the victim, claiming Carter had set her up, but nobody bought it. The evidence was undeniable. When the verdict was finally read, guilty on all counts, the courtroom erupted in approval. Karen was sentenced to 7 years in prison, her hateful reign over the neighborhood officially over. Carter watched it all unfold with a quiet sense of satisfaction. Justice had been served. But beyond that, something even greater had happened. The community had come together in a way he had never seen before. With Karen gone, a new sense of unity spread through the neighborhood. People who had once kept to themselves started reaching out, checking in on each other, and forming bonds that hadn't existed before. For years, some families had felt isolated, unsure if they were truly welcome. Now, they knew they were. The community was making a statement: hate had no home here. Carter became an even bigger figure in town, not just as a sheriff but as a symbol of resilience and strength. He helped organize town hall meetings about inclusion, worked with local schools to teach kids about tolerance, and made sure that no one else would ever have to endure what he had. One evening, as he sat on his porch drinking a cup of coffee, he noticed something different. Neighbors, black, white, Latino, Asian, were gathered in the park across the street, chatting and laughing. Kids played together without a care in the world. Families who had never spoken before were now sharing meals. Carter smiled. For so long, Karen had tried to divide them. But in the end, all she had done was bring them closer together.